I want to start by admitting that, yes, I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak with you and as an uninvited guest here in the territories of the Coast Salish people. I don't identify as an Indigenous person. I come as a settler and a descendant of settlers and an outsider. And being an outsider comes with certain responsibilities, which I felt for the first time. Can you change the slide? I felt for the first time after being invited to a community in southern Brazil called Tequavia by some Guarani leaders there. The Guarani are a diverse indigenous people in South America. And my partner Dana, who's helping with the video today, and I were invited to visit. And in return, we were asked to share the beauty of that visit, kind of the richness of the visit after we left. So this is a photo of some of the incredible artisanal baskets that they made there. And so as I reflect on being a visitor to these territories, the Coast Salish territories, I'm reminded of the warmth that came with that invitation to Tequa Via and the privilege and responsibility that came along with that. So I'm going to share something that I learned from the Guarani territorial acknowledgements with you folks. It was imparted to me by UBC professor Vanessa Andriotti. So the Guarani territorial acknowledgement has kind of 4 parts. So first we acknowledge our ancestors, the people that came before us. We also then, the second part, we acknowledge the place in which we're gathered. That's the space here. And the people who made this space possible. So the Coast Salish people as stewards of the land, but also everybody who was involved in organizing the conference and organizing this space. The next is we acknowledge that we're all parentes, which is the Portuguese word for relatives. We all share a literal common ground. And last, we acknowledge that taken together, all of these 3 other acknowledgements, they pass on to us, they confer a responsibility to the people that came before us, the people around us, and the people to come next. So my talk today for you folks is exactly about that, our responsibilities to one another and to those who will come after us in the context of food systems change. Can you change the slide, please? So I'm Evan. I'm a student at UBC. I'm an urban political ecologist, so that means I study environmental problems associated with the relationship between the city and everything around the city. We're embedded in some industrial relations of production and extraction and waste, and these are very harmful. And so I'm interested in what urban people can do about those, what they do about those, and to expand the thinking about what we can do about those problems and problematic relations. So as part of my acknowledgement, I just want to also point out that my research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, MyTex International, and the PSI, the Public Scholars Initiative. And today we got some funding to support this event through this Center for Community Engaged Learning at UBC. You can find out more about my work at evanbonus.ca. I'm also an amateur videographer and photographer, and you can even find a video about the Tequavia community on my page. I can change it. So I'm going to begin by summarizing my whole talk in one sentence. And this is drawn from a paper that I wrote with Hannah Whitman this year. The whole talk can kind of be summarized as urban agriculture, which is what we're all here kind of to talk about, can both support and detract from our responsibilities as urban people to mobilize for food sovereignty, but without decolonization, there can be no food sovereignty. So let's start with what is food sovereignty. As a urban political ecologist, the thing that I study is food sovereignty and food sovereignty movements, and kind of how those play out in the context of cities. So food sovereignty is defined as the right of people to a healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. Sorry, I forgot to change the slide. I'll remember next time. These things aren't connected, so it's a coordination issue. So basically, food sovereignty is the right to democratically build sustainable food systems unimpeded by the concentration of elite wealth and governments that bolster profit-seeking corporations. The idea of food sovereignty has roots in a transnational social movement organization, La Via Campesina, which means the peasant way in Spanish. It's a network of 182 organizations across 81 countries, representing over 200 million peasants and resource-poor farmers and food providers. La Via Campesina sees people and food systems as being dominated by powerful economic and political actors, and it's a struggle between them and the people who provide our food, and the winners tend to be the powerful economic actors, and the losers tend to be the people and the environment. So La Via Campesina launched this idea of food sovereignty in 1996 at the World Food Summit in Rome, and it was meant to mobilize or galvanize this struggle. So who are the people in the food sovereignty framework? In a declaration made at a global summit in 2007 in Mali, the food sovereignty movement's people define themselves as peasants, family farmers, artisanal fisher folks, indigenous people, landless people, rural workers, migrants, pastoralists, forest communities, women, youth, consumers, and environmental and urban movements. So in other words, food providers, eaters, and activists. So there's two parts of this, and it's called the struggle. There's the food providers, eaters, and activists against the powerful economic and political actors, and they're in a social struggle. The struggle is over land, it's over seeds, it's over farmer livelihoods, it's over food security, it's over ecosystem health, and it's over gender and racial equity. And it's a global struggle. And in the fight between these two groups, in claiming the right for food sovereignty, the people have to organize socially and mobilize as a social movement. So that's the framework. So to summarize, we've got this group of people trying to claim their right to food sovereignty, or their right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own agricultural systems. And they do that through what's called social mobilization. I have to apologize for being out of breath. I've got bruised ribs, so it's kind of tricky to breathe. So if I sound like I'm gasping, that's why. Okay, so could you change the slide, please? So I study this in the context of cities and urban places. Most people think of food sovereignty as something that happens in the countryside, and they're peasants, and that's in the global south. But this also happens in urban places and in the global north. So the people also includes food movements and eaters and urban food movements. So many of us in attendance here today are what Hannah and I call urban agrarians. So these are folks that live in cities. They're concerned about the health of the land and the people that steward that land to provide the food that we eat. So this is concern for land that's both in the countryside, but also land that's in the city. So these people, these urban agrarians, which I'm assuming many of you in the audience could be considered urban agrarians. These folks are primed for social mobilization. They're already attuned to the problems in the food system, and they're good potential participants in this food sovereignty movement. So the argument that I want to make is that people who live in cities, regardless if they're urban agrarians or not, they have a responsibility to mobilize in solidarity for food sovereignty. That's in defense of land and food providers, both in the city and in the countryside. So we have this responsibility to food lands and food providers, not because we directly have a legal responsibility or a specific responsibility to them, but because we have a relational responsibility to them. So I just want to shift our thinking a little bit, or propose a different understanding of responsibility, defined relationally by drawing on indigenous cosmologies and critical geographies. So let's unpack this idea of responsibility, and what do I mean by relational responsibility? Specifically, unlike the legalistic version of responsibility understood in personal agency, what physical or legal persons directly do or fail to do, responsibility can also be considered relationally, in that we are responsible for the relations that we belong to. In other words, our relational responsibility extends beyond being responsible for what we do. We are relationally responsible, not because what we do or fail to do, but because of our identities, because of who we are. Thought of relationally, identity is shaped through the process of the embodiment of material, like food, and the social relations with diverse human and non-human others, including the land, the ecologies, and food providers. These relations extend both across space and time. So we are what we eat, and that means that we are the people and the places that grow the food that we eat. As such, relational responsibility extends beyond the here and now. The present is born of the past. Movement through time and space and relations with those in our lives shape our identities and therefore our responsibilities. So how does this apply to urban agriculture? Well, first of all, relational responsibility positions cities and everybody in cities as responsible for causing problems resulting from our industrial food system. And similarly, it positions urban people as being responsible for addressing them. But while cities and people who live in them should be responsible for addressing those problems, not all people in cities are equally responsible. So it's conceptually opposite to marginalization. Privilege has been a core topic in critical race and feminist thought. It can be broadly defined as a beneficial resource, so symbolic or material, available to some people but not others, where access or exclusion to that resource is determined based on one's class, race, gender, ability, sexuality, or other identity category. So to restate, privilege means the benefits in the form of time or resources or authority or status accrue to some social groups at the expense of others. So privilege is a product of relations that shape our identities across time and space. And given the distribution of privilege in cities, that means that there's a concentration of those resources among the few. Because of that, people in cities are responsible for changing and addressing problems in the countryside in at least two senses. First, because urban people amass the food that's grown outside the city and benefit disproportionately from the infrastructure around creating cities, urban people are more responsible than people in the countryside, based on our relationship with the land and how we benefit from it more. Second, because of the inequality in cities, some people in cities, some urban people, are more responsible to mobilize for food sovereignty than others. Change. Okay, now I want to turn to urban agriculture. And I think urban agriculture is important to this idea of urban agrarianism and social mobilization in at least three ways. So first, I think it connects people to food systems problems by building food literacy. I'm sure lots of you folks are super familiar with this idea. We learn about the food system through engaging in urban agriculture. We learn about the necessity to work with nature. We learn about the limitations that the land provides and imposes. We learn about the struggle involved in growing food. And we learn about food systems by extrapolating that. But also, urban agriculture in Vancouver in particular makes food systems issues visible. As some people that I talked to in the research that I did, with people in Metro Vancouver, by the way. This chapter is based on a bunch of conversations I had with the broader urban farming community here. A lot of folks talked about how urban agriculture keeps food systems on the front of the mind. Right? Once you learn about them, once you think about them, once you see them all around you, you become more attuned to them. But also, urban agriculture can demobilize people from food system struggles. That means that it stops us from participating in social struggles and social mobilization that takes us away from the city and directs our energy inward. You can change it. And also, urban agriculture is an area that's touched by privilege. So I want to recognize that. One form of privilege that's increasingly talked about in this community is racial privilege. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a session today. I know some of you will be attending. But there are other kinds of privilege too: class privilege, male privilege, cisgender privilege. These are all things that provide some people with more of a benefit, more of an advantage than others. And so therefore more responsibility than others. And this applies in the context of urban agriculture as well. As one urban agrarian said, we need to acknowledge that a lot of us live a life of privilege. We have transportation, we have language, we have economic means to go to a farmer's market. It's not an issue for a lot of people, but sometimes just to get to the grocery store on the way home is the only reasonable solution until finances or situations change. So not everybody has necessarily the privilege to be able to participate in urban agriculture. So I wanted to just highlight that there's a couple of different ways that privilege plays out in the context of urban agriculture, and I'll highlight just three. People often who participate in urban ag, it means that they have the privilege, they have the time to be able to do that. Or they might be people who are struggling to earn a living by selling the food that they grow, and they depend on people who have the privilege to buy local food. Or they might be marginalized and forced or left with no other opportunities but to grow their own food to feed themselves in the face of social marginalization. So it's an activity that's imbued with different kinds of privilege in different kinds of ways. So that stops some people from being able to participate in wider political engagement by limiting the amount of time and resources they have available to them. But there's also a connection to people who have more ability, who can contribute more to social mobilization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the examples of people that had been in or are involved in urban agriculture that have participated and have claimed this responsibility to food systems in defense of land that I talked to some folks in this community about. And they fall into four categories. So there's struggles in the city, over land in the city. There's struggles land that's nearby or around the city. There's struggles that are beyond the city. And then there are also struggles over the nature of property and territory itself. Let me change the slide. Okay. First, mobilizing in the city. So secure and long-term land access is a huge problem. I'm sure everybody is fairly familiar with this challenge as associated with urban ag. But when it comes to land conflicts between urban growing and property development, often it's the same story. The gardens are relocated, usually to a less desirable location, or simply ended. This isn't always the case, but the struggle generally tends in this direction. One big and very visible, notable exception was the Save the UBC Farm campaign in 2008. So a student-led mobilization successfully opposed the relocation of a 24-hectare teaching and demonstration growing farm at the University of British Columbia, which was slated for condo development. Oh, weird, you can't really tell, but there's a picture there. It's a picture of UBC Farm today, which now has condos encroaching on it, visible through a thinning tree line that's the barrier, the boundary. We did save the farm, this movement did save the farm, but the reminder of property encroachment is very visible there still. And you'd be able to see it if the picture showed up behind me. So this was an example of social mobilization that successfully responded to a land struggle and stopped property development from taking away one of the most incredible urban ag sites that I've ever been to. But you can still see that pressure there. It's still very visible. It doesn't actually tell us, the story is inspiring, but it doesn't tell us a story about social struggles that are a little bit further away. Can you change the slide when you're done that? So another struggle is to mobilize for land that's around the city. So in Richmond, there's another one of these problems happening that was just one over the financialization of land in the area. So this is most clearly expressed, or most visibly expressed, I should say, as landowners began to build mega mansions on ALR land. Some of them are giant dwellings reaching 20,000 square feet. The commonly held concern here is that these houses are being built under the assumption that that land would be one day removed from the ALR, and the restrictions on what could be done with the land would be removed along with it. So this drove the value of the property up, and it made it inaccessible to a lot of farmers, even urban farmers who wanted to use the land in Richmond. So a social movement group called Farm Watch and others assembled and spoke out against this. And in November 2018, there was a public hearing to restrict the building on ALR land in Richmond, and they won. The short story here is in February of 2019, a bylaw went into place and now restricts building to 400 meters on ALR property in Richmond, which is smaller than the province-wide restriction of 500 meters. So this is another case where there's a policy victory, in this case, owed partly to social mobilization with participants from the urban agriculture community, who, with this victory, have made it so that property development in the area will be slowed for a time at least, which gives us an opportunity to redirect to property struggles elsewhere. You can change the slide. Or property struggles beyond the city. Again, not a super clear, not a super bright bulb, so not a super clear photo, but this is Site C. The Farmland Defense League of BC, which is another social movement group that has urban agrarian participants in it from Metro Vancouver, has played a role in marshalling urban support for protest against the hydroelectric dam known as Site C. Some agronomists have estimated that this is going to impact 12,000 hectares in the Peace River Valley in northeastern BC, an area over twice the size of all the ALR land in Richmond. So whereas the UBC Farm campaign and the Farm Watch campaigns, they address issues that were spatially nearby, things that you could see, that were visible. There tends to be weaker social mobilization for issues that are more geographically distant. So Site C being over 1,000 kilometers away from Richmond. As one peri-urban farmer noted, that's the problem with Site C. It's so far away that we don't get the same support for trying to save farmland up north. People just don't get it. But we can see the Richmond mega mansions, and people look at them and they hate them, so they want to change that. So whether or not urban agrarianism translates into political action, therefore, depends on a number of things. And one of those is the perceived immediacy of the concern, how close the land is to us. But we can't forget about farmland that's further away. Change it. And these lands, as in these property struggles, they also happen within the context of a colonial project of dispossession. So with the historic passage of Bill C-41 in late 2019, it legislates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UNDRIP, into BC law and puts the ALR as a mechanism for institutionalizing dispossession in the form of farmland protection on notice. So the city of Vancouver officially voted to recognize that it was founded on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And these territories were never ceded through treaty, war, or surrender. That's a quote from the city. As such, urban and peri-urban agriculture alike in Metro Vancouver are part of the ongoing occupation of sovereign nations. This is part of our identity as urban settlers and urban agrarians. As one urban farmer who grows vegetables for sale on private lawns and backyards uncomfortably acknowledged, these are homeowners' lands, but really this is unceded territory. And so there's this piece of it, this territory piece, I think, and then this weird piece that exists for all of us in the city, having private ownership, but then also trying to use space in a sharing economy sort of way. So there's a tension here, and increasingly we need to recognize and acknowledge it. So furthermore, considering land as property at all is against the Indigenous land ethic, which Don Morrison, the coordinator of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, states, does not view the land and the food system or any part thereof as a commodity to be bought and sold in the market economy, nor do we view it as a resource or a product to be exploited for external means. Based on values of interdependency, respect, reciprocity, and ecological and cultural integrity, an Indigenous land ethic views humans as part of nature and not separate and dominate over it. So healthy land, access to it, care for it, is therefore central to Indigenous ontologies and Indigenous sovereignty struggles. So in land-based Indigenous communities, this includes the right to grow and gather traditional foods in traditional territories, which often means access to uncontaminated, non-ecological spaces. Non-urban ecological spaces, sorry. But there are also reasons that Indigenous communities may see a benefit to urban lands as places where Indigenous culture and intergenerational learning and relationships can grow and be maintained, especially for Indigenous residents, urban Indigenous residents. That's to say that urban agriculture can be a source of what we call indigenization, or centering and valuing of Indigenous people, worldview, and cultures in otherwise colonial structures and spaces. To provide some modest examples of community-based initiatives at UBC Farm that do this, there's the Tuwasht Garden, or the Wet'suwet'en Garden, the Musqueam name gifted to the space, the place where we grow. These are spaces that can serve as an opportunity to build urban, non-Indigenous allyship alongside with food systems literacy and urban gardens organized by Indigenous communities. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission also charged settlers with a responsibility to act in a certain number of ways beyond this. So while urban agrarians care about the land and we care about food providers, the recognition alone is insufficient. The TRC says it calls for awareness of the past, also acknowledgement of the harm that's been done, but also atonement for the causes and action to change behavior. Anything that perpetuates colonial injustice needs to be addressed through action. Further, if that action doesn't support decolonization, as Michelle Daigle puts it, it makes a spectacle out of reconciliation. As such, Canada's ongoing colonial history problematizes any settler claim for the right to use agricultural land, and therefore confers responsibility for urban settlers to mobilize in defense of not just food sovereignty and not just land, but also for Indigenous food sovereignty and decolonization. So, can you change it? To summarize, based on the ideas of food sovereignty, we're going to get you to interact based on this in just a second. Based on the ideas of food sovereignty, urban people have a relational responsibility to mobilize collectively in social movements that defend the practice of growing food and harvesting food sustainably, both in the city and beyond the city. Urban agriculture on its own has played a role here as a literacy function. That means it teaches people about food systems problems, and it also has a visibility function. That means it keeps food systems on the mind of people in the city and also on the urban agenda. But it also has that potential to demobilize people. That means we can focus in towards the city on our own growing spaces and managing the problems that urban farmers have in the day-to-day operations at the expense of mobilizing politically beyond those spaces. When it comes to participating in social movements to defend land, that looks a couple different ways. We discussed mobilization in the city, like the UBC Farm campaign. Mobilization around the city, as in the Richmond mega mansion struggle. The potential to mobilize beyond the city, as in struggling against the Site C development. And then also, alongside that, though, or above that, there's also a necessity to recognize that these struggles in and of themselves do nothing to repatriate lands lost to colonial conquest, and therefore we must participate in struggles over the nature of property itself as well. So on one hand, we've got urban people who have the responsibility to engage in food sovereignty struggles, and on the other hand, you have colonial harms that's being perpetuated and must be addressed. So responsibility here in this context means honoring promises enshrined in state commitments to Indigenous people and relinquishing control of lands used in the continued supply of food to cities. This starts with urban people's responsibility to show up for struggles for Indigenous sovereignty. Here, there's a shift in prioritizing Indigenous rights above the right to use land for food and for urban food consumers. And I'll just conclude with the statement that there can be no food sovereignty without decolonization. You can change it. Okay, so for about the next half hour or so, I want us to have a little bit of a dialogue and interaction based on some of the topics that I've raised, the ideas that I raised here. So this talk has tried to connect, I guess, 4 main things. First, we have privilege as members of certain social groups, that the benefits accrue to some groups and not others, and to recognize the privileges that we have, owing to our class, our race, our gender, our sexuality, our ability. And we also must recognize the responsibilities that come along with privileges. As urban people, and as privileged people within urban spaces. So that means we have to ask questions like, what are the people and places that make us who we are? What do we owe them? What are our obligations to them? And specifically in the context of our discussion here today, we need to talk about who feeds us, What are the places that feed us, and what do we owe those places? What are our responsibilities to those people and places? Another topic that we talked a little bit about is struggles. That is, what is being lost, what stakes are being lost in the concentration of power in the food system, and do our privileges require that we contribute more to mobilize in response to those struggles? And the last thing that I wanted to add to this is that by raising all these ideas, by pointing to our responsibility, by identifying the struggles, by identifying opportunities to mobilize, what commitment does that raise for us? Is there something that we should be doing more of, or are there opportunities in which we can participate in social struggles as an ally and as a support?